everyone, and welcome to this podcast that will be dedicated to the Pupino case. I'm Laviro Buono, I'm the head of Section 3 at ERA. Section 3 is the section that deals with European criminal law. In our conferences, in our seminars, we cover topics such as fight against cybercrime, drug trafficking, money laundering, defense rights, victims' rights, so on, so forth. In 2022, ERA turns 30. To mark its 30th anniversary, we prepared a very special podcast series, 30 Years of ERA, 30 Cases of the Court of Justice of the European Union. In this podcast, as I said, we will focus on the Pupino case, a case of 2005. We shall all have a flashback of 15, 16 years, and we noticed that even the terminology was a different one back in 2005, because at that time we used to have the first, the second, and the third pillar being justice and home affairs. Now we do not have this structure anymore. We have EU law as such. At that time, the main legal instruments in criminal justice were the so-called framework decisions. And framework decisions, contrary to directives, did not have a direct effect. Finally, when it comes to the voting procedure, the rule was unanimity within the Council, while now we know that the rule is a co-decision between the European Parliament and the Council. So why is Pupino considered a landmark? Well, Pupino refers to a 2001 framework decision on the standing of victims in criminal proceedings. It is considered a landmark because for the first time ever, the court in Luxembourg ruled that framework decisions do not have a direct effect. However, they do have an indirect effect. In doing so, the court exported, so to say, the indirect effect from the first to the third pillar. In this podcast, we will scrutinize the significance of the Pupino case for the criminal justice system. And we will do so by asking few key questions to our expert. We have the pleasure to have with us Professor Anne Weyenberg, Professor of European Criminal Law, Free University of Brussels, and main coordinator of ECLAN, the European Criminal Law Academic Network. Enjoy the podcast.
So let's start with a brief reminder about the context of that Court of Justice decision. So this Pupino judgment of the court, and also a brief reminder about the main impact or the main lessons of that decision. So first about the context. So as it was already said, this decision by the court dates back 16 June 2005. So this decision was amongst the first judgments issued by the Court of Justice in EU criminal law. It was issued at a quite early stage of the development of the EU area for criminal justice, in a context that was quite different from the context of today. And this context was quite different from today, both institutionally and substantially. Institutionally, of course, because it intervened under the framework of the so-called third pillar of the Treaty on the European Union. And as you may know, of course, this third pillar was deeply marked by its intergovernmental predominance, which means that at the time, the Court of Justice had only limited competences in criminal matters. And another consequence of this, well, predominant intergovernmental nature of the framework of that time was that specific legal tools were available, which were different from the usual EU tools or EC tools. So at the time, the EU legislator used framework decisions which were tools, EU tools, less efficient than the usual directives and regulations. And so those framework decisions were binding, but explicitly deprived of direct effects by the treaty itself. So as a consequence, the context in 2005 was marked by a deficit of efficiency and of effectiveness of the legal tools at hand in criminal matters. The context was also very different from the context of today in terms of some substance. So 2005 meant a few years after the entry into force of the Amsterdam Treaty. And so the context was a context of course, less legal integration or a less deep integration than the context of today. It was, well, a few years late after the entry into force of the Amsterdam Treaty. And so we were at the time in the first years of implementation of the objective, the new objective of the EU to establish and maintain an area of freedom, security, and justice. So the context was different, of course, than the context of today. Few words about the case. So the judgment was a preliminary ruling on the interpretation of some provisions of the framework decision of 2001 on the standing of victims in criminal proceedings. The case concerned a nursery school teacher charged with inflicting injuries on pupils' age of less than 5 years at the time of the facts. And so questions had been referred to the Court of Justice by an Italian court. And the idea was to know whether the testimonies of the child witnesses and victims should be taken according to a special procedure, which was under national law, so namely Italian law, only applicable to sexual offenses or offenses with a sexual background. So to, well, offenses different from the ones which were concerned or covered by the case at hand. What were the main lessons or the main conclusions of the Court of Justice in these judgments? And I will, of course, not come back on all aspects of that judgment. The main conclusion was that, well, the court extended the principle of interpretation in conformity with EC law to the framework decisions of the third pillar of the Treaty on the European Union. So as you know, this principle of interpretation in conformity with EC law is one of the, well, basic principle of EC law, according to which there is an obligation, there is a duty for the national judges to interpret their national law in conformity with EC law, now with EU law. And in its judgment, the court relied on two main arguments to extend this principle, so this obligation to framework decisions of the third pillar of the Treaty of the Union. And so these two main arguments were the following. First, the binding nature of the framework decisions. And here the court made an interesting comparison between the framework decisions on the one hand and the directives. And so the court underlined that, well, a common point, a common feature between both tools was the fact that they were both mandatory in terms of the objectives to achieve. So this binding nature of the framework decision was particularly highlighted by the Court of Justice in its reasoning. And the second argument put forward by the court was the principle of sincere cooperation. So the court based its reasoning on this principle of sincere cooperation, considering that it was also applicable in the third pillar of the Treaty on the European Union. But what was also interesting in that judgment was that the court admitted the same limits to this principle as in the first pillar of the treaty, as in EC law. So it extended both the principle and its limits to the third pillar of the treaty. So it's considered that the principle of interpretation in conformity with EU law was to be applied within the third pillar with the following limits, so that it cannot serve as the basis for an interpretation of national law contra legem, so against the letter of a national law, and that it can neither serve as the basis for an interpretation of national law that would be against, that would be contrary to the general principles of law, which form part of EU law, and especially against the principles of legal certainty and of non-retroactivity. So this was, I would say, the core or central lessons, the central conclusions of the court in this famous, well-known Pupino case. Of course, at the time, the Pupino judgment was essential, fundamental for the efficacy and for the effectiveness of EU criminal law. The court considered that although the framework decisions cannot have any direct effects on national provisions, they can have some sort of indirect effect, because they must be taken into consideration in the internal legal orders through this obligation for the national judges to interpret their national laws in conformity with these framework decisions provisions. And so, as a result of the Pupino decision, the regimes applicable in the then first and third pillars of the treaty were kind of, I would say, approximated. It allowed to reinforce or strengthen the efficacy or effectiveness of the available legal tools in the third pillar, namely the framework decisions. And so as a consequence, it allows to kind of partially correct the efficacy deficit from which EU criminal law suffered at that moment. So that's it for, well, the context, the case, and the main lessons of the judgments. So a third part is, of course, to know whether the lessons of these Pupino judgments are still valid or still topical today. Of course, the context has considerably evolved, both institutionally and substantially. Institutionally, as you know, the Lisbon Treaty intervened and entered into force in December 2009. And this Lisbon Treaty communitarized EU criminal law. So it submitted it to the normal, I would say, EC methods. So this had, of course, a whole series of consequences, among which the fact that the Court of Justice enjoys now, and since then, its full set of competences. Another consequence, of course, is also that directives and regulations are, since 2009, so since the entry into force of the Treaty of Lisbon, available. Substantially, the context is also very different, of course, from the one in 2005 when Pupino was issued. Substantially, we have achieved a lot since then, and the level of legal integration, especially, well, the progress which were made in terms of cooperation, judicial cooperation through mutual recognition, for instance, has been quite spectacular. Another element illustrating or representative of the change of context is the fact that the framework decision of 2001 on the standing of victims in criminal proceeding that had to be interpreted by the court in this Pupino case has since then been replaced by a new instrument, namely by a directive of October 2012, directive establishing minimum standards on the rights, support, and protection of victims of crime. So the context is quite different. However, I would say that Pupino is still topical today and important to understand the interactions between EU criminal law and the national legal orders. Because all EU legal instruments adopted in the framework of the third pillar have not been replaced by directives or regulations. So legal instruments of different generations continue to coexist. Various framework decisions are still applicable today. For instance, and this is, of course, one of the main framework decisions still applicable today, for instance, the framework decision of 2002 on the European arrest warrant and surrender procedures. But other mutual recognition framework decisions in criminal matters are also still applicable today. So Pupino is still important to understand the impact of those instruments, those framework decisions of the third pillar, which are still applicable today on national law. Of course, one should take into consideration other important judgments that have been rendered since then. And one of them is, of course, the Meloni case. So this judgment, very famous judgment as well, of 26 February 2013, where the court especially highlighted the importance of the principle of primacy of EU law on national law. And in this, of course, case, but in other cases as well, but Meloni is one of the cases which was important in this respect. In this case, the court considered that this primacy principle is also valid or applicable to framework decisions. The topicality, I would say, of the Pupino judgment is also confirmed by several more recent decisions of the court. And here I would like especially to remind you about, well, two important cases. One about the European arrest warrant. It's a decision by the Court of Justice of June 2019, in the Poplavsky case. And another one of 4 March 2020 in the case 183/18 about the framework decision of 2005 on the application of the principle of mutual recognition to financial penalties. In these two cases, the question that was referred to the court was to know whether those framework decisions must be interpreted as meaning that they require a national court to refrain from applying a provision of national law that is incompatible with one of their provisions. And in both cases, the courts recalled that in order to ensure the effectiveness of all provisions of EU law, the primacy principle requires, especially, national courts to interpret to the greater extent possible their national law in conformity with EU law. That where it is unable to interpret national law in compliance with the requirements of EU law, especially because of the limits of this principle I reminded you about earlier, any national court has the obligation to refrain from applying any provision of national law which is contrary to a provision of EU law if such law has direct effects. By contrast, a provision of EU law which does not have direct effect may not be relied on as such in order to disapply a provision of national law that conflicts with it. Now, considering that the two framework decisions in question So the one on the European arrest warrant and the one on financial penalties were adopted under the third pillar of the Treaty of the Union, and are still deprived of direct effects. These two framework decisions must be interpreted as meaning that they do not require a national court to refrain from applying a provision of national law that is incompatible with one of its provisions, because they are still, again, I repeat, deprived of direct effect. And because of these limits to the primacy principle, Pupino, the Pupino case and the lessons or the conclusions of the court in this case are still, in my opinion, important today and topical today. Thank you very much.